This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to China Global Television Network. This is The World Today. I'm Hannah Viviers in Nairobi. Here are your top stories. U.S. Embassy authorizes voluntary departure of some staff from Ethiopia as concerns grow over raging conflict. Hopes of a breakthrough in Sudan as leaders signal mediation talks are bearing fruit. And global transition to clean energy takes center stage at the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. Well, the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia has authorized a voluntary departure of non-emergency government staff and family members due to armed conflict in the country. The decision comes after the United States expressed its concerns about the escalating violence in Ethiopia. The U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, is expected to travel to Ethiopia for talks with the Ethiopian government. Rebels continue to seize territory after aligning with another force called the Oromo Liberation Army. In the past week, they've captured key cities, including Kombolcha, less than 400 kilometers from the capital, Addis Ababa. Well, CGTN's Guram Chala joins us now from Addis Ababa. Guram, thank you so much for joining us. The U.S. Embassy has authorized the voluntary departure of non-emergency staff. Tell us more about this and how other foreign missions are responding to the unfolding security situation there, Guram.
Well, Hannah, obviously, due to first the perhaps capture of the two important cities, Kombolcha and Dese city by the TPLF force, and also the declaration, the nationwide declaration of state of emergency has made so many members of the embassies residing here in Addis Ababa to panic and perhaps contemplate withdrawing from the country and getting back to their respective nations. But it was the United States which came up with security alerts in the first place. Citizens should be alerted not to travel outside of Addis Ababa. Non-essential travels to Ethiopia should be avoided. But now, as you've said, the United States is now calling on embassy workers, non-essential embassy workers, to willingly leave the country with their families. Other embassies are also following suit. By the way, this is expected with other situations in this country. Before, when there is a state of emergency, embassies also come up with this kind of alerts. But this time around, we understand and we can feel that there are embassies and mission workers who are in panic mode and are contemplating to leave the country and are also preparing mass withdrawal from the nation as well. So this is what we know at the moment.
Guram, rebels have been making advances and threatening to march on the capital, Addis Ababa. This has raised concern about the safety of people there. What is the situation in the capital at the moment with regard, particularly with residents? You talked about panic among some of the foreign people that might be working there, but what about the residents in the capital?
Well, this is now the third day since the nationwide state of emergency was declared, and 2 full days we've seen since yesterday and today. The city, the capital city, Addis Ababa, remains to be calm by and large. There are no reports of any insecurity. Of course, there are checkpoints where police checks cars and people at the same time. This is what is also mentioned on the state of emergency guidelines themselves. Unless and otherwise, those are issues to talk about. We haven't seen any unusual activity in the city, and city residents are doing their jobs, going to work, coming back, going to cafes, restaurants, and other places at the same time. The movement on the street is also the same. The only difference is at night, people are getting home earlier than expected, although there is no curfew that is declared at the moment. So we can report again that in Addis Ababa and other cities down at Hawassa, Adama, and others, security is tight and there is no unusual activity, although there is a state of emergency declared and there is a threat of the TPLF and OLA forces promising to march to the capital city.
Thank you so much for that, Guram. We'll continue speaking with you as the story unfolds. Guram Chala speaking to us from Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Well, Sudan could be close to a power-sharing deal for its civilian-led transitional government. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan made the announcement at a meeting with an envoy from the African Union. He said the military is in the process of appointing a prime minister who will then select what he called a civilian government of technocrats. This comes 1 week after the military seized power, triggering huge protests and international condemnation. It's been a little more than a week since the military seized power in Sudan. The UN Security Council has urged Sudanese military and civilian government officials to end the crisis. The UN Special Envoy in Sudan has expressed hope that the two sides' ongoing discussion will soon bear fruit. Naba Muhyiddin has more.
Mediation efforts are underway to find a solution for Sudan's political crisis. But before the military takeover, there was political polarization between the transitional counterparts. Pro-military groups wanted the military to seize power and appoint a new government, while pro-democracy supporters wanted civilian leaders to take control. After the military's power grab, which saw Prime Minister Hamdok detained, residents of the capital Khartoum are still divided.
When we rallied in 2019, we protested against al-Bashir and his Islamic military regime. Hamdok was doing great steps towards democratic change. We wanted democracy and a civilian rule and can't accept to get back to dictatorship.
The generals should form a government out of technocrats, and then the political party should have time to be prepared for elections. Hamdok and the political parties weren't elected. They came in certain circumstances and they ruined it.
Mass demonstrations erupted over the weekend. 4 protesters were killed and 10 were injured in clashes with authorities, according to Sudan's Doctors' Committee. Analysts like Osman Mergani think the reinstatement of the transitional government can be a solution.
It's not logical to sustain democracy out of a military coup. Even if we believed the military want to save the country, showing goodwill by releasing the detained politicians is the first step towards the solution. Things should get back to a day before the takeover.
Many internal and international efforts continue to contain the dispute in Sudan, but generals and politicians are clinging to their decisions. Prime Minister Hamdok has refused to be part of the military administration and is sticking on his legitimacy, but the generals insist on forming a new government.
Although many businesses have resumed work a week after the military takeover, there is a cautious silence in many streets of the Sudanese capital. People here are awaiting solutions to end the political turmoil. Naba Muhyiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
The COP26 UN Climate Conference continues in Glasgow. Banks, insurers, and investors worth around $130 trillion at their disposal pledged on Wednesday to put combating climate change at the center of their work. Reporting from Glasgow, here's Andrew Wilson.
In the end, climate summits are all about the money, and with the leaders gone, the finance teams can now get to work. The problems are constant. When will the wealthy countries properly subsidise the greening of the planet that they polluted? From the UK, a pledge that big firms will be obliged to demonstrate their plans for climate change targets by 2023, with the US on board as well.
Today, I'm announcing that the UK will go further and become the first ever net zero aligned financial centre. This means we are going to move towards making it mandatory for firms to publish a clear, deliverable plan.
I agree we must all do more, and the United States is stepping up. President Biden has already announced that we're quadrupling our international climate finance for developing countries by 2024 to more than $11 billion.
Also, the announcement that 450 companies from across the global business spectrum, firms that control a staggering $130 trillion, will now align themselves to the 1.5-degree global temperature rise, so-called blended finance.
There are facilities that are being developed that can do this. We need to scale them dramatically. Quite frankly, facilities that do not scale up to 100 billion a year in additional flows aren't relevant to the scale of the problem.
We have a long way to go on coverage, but the shift in integrating carbon price is there, and we are working very hard to support countries to take that shift.
At the start of the conference, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, warned of empty promises, a deficit of credibility, he called it, a surplus of confusion over targets. In other words, who's going to police these impressive-sounding pledges and test their authenticity? The United Nations, governments, the companies themselves, or a special panel? That's a debate that many here feel is already long overdue. The protest groups have their own position on conference promises and see it as their role to challenge them, with demonstrations like this one at a nearby oil refinery.
We want to hear that their actions are appropriate with the emergency we're in. We don't want to hear more talk. We don't want to hear more pledges for 2030, for 2035, for 2050. We need action immediately, right now.
Finances will long remain a troubling sticking point as poor and rich try to collaborate without losing out. The sentiment is positive, and wealthy figures like Bill Gates are never far from events like these. But the occasional reference to COP27 so early in the process suggests some early cans are already being kicked down the road. Andrew Wilson, CGTN, Glasgow.
Well, John Beaver is at that summit in Glasgow. He now joins us for more on what we can expect today. John, good to speak to you again. The summit, delegates at the summit are deliberating on the global transition to clean energy. What is the latest there, John, and what challenges lie ahead?
Well, coal is the single biggest contributor to global warming. Today we've heard that more than 40 countries have signed up to a pledge to move away from it. The timeline for that is the 2030s for major economies, the 2040s for minor ones. Protesters already saying that's not soon enough, but that's what's been signed. Interestingly, places like China, the US and Russia have not signed that deal. That's because they rely heavily on coal at the moment. All have promised that they're going to use less of it, but not ready to sign that pledge. We've also heard this week about the $8.5 billion deal for South Africa going green, helping it move away from coal. South Africa, of course, a place that sometimes struggles to keep the lights on, and coal is the biggest source of power there. So it's a major deal, and what we're hearing is that the wealthy Western nations want to use that deal with South Africa as a blueprint to use elsewhere, across Africa, across other areas of the developing world. So all eyes are on this big switch away from coal and the urgency that's needed to make sure that we can do that and do it quickly to help save the planet.
Thank you so much for all that. John Beaver speaking to us from COP26. Well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you then.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
U.S. Embassy authorizes voluntary departure of some staff from Ethiopia as concerns grow over raging conflict. Sudan inches closer to a deal 1 week after the military seized power. And African leaders share their plans to avert climate change crises at the ongoing summit in Glasgow. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers. Here are more stories making headlines. In business, the IMF nears a debt relief deal with cash-strapped Zambia. And in your sports, Senegal's Sadio Mane on target as Liverpool head into the knockout at the UEFA Champions League. But we have more coverage of the situation in Ethiopia. The U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia has authorized the voluntary departure of non-emergency government staff and family members. The decision comes after the United States expressed its concerns about the escalating violence in the country. The U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, is expected to travel to Ethiopia for talks with the Ethiopian government. Rebels continue to seize territory after aligning with another force called the Oromo Liberation Army. In the past week, they've captured key cities, including Kombolcha, less than 400 kilometers from Addis Ababa. Well, meanwhile, our correspondents based in Ethiopia are reporting calm in the capital, Addis Ababa. The situation, as we just mentioned, remains dire. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed made a strong worded statement on Wednesday, pledging to bury his government's enemies. He made the comments at a ceremony marking a year since the war in the Tigray region began. On Tuesday, the Ethiopian government declared a state of emergency in the country. It urged citizens to arm themselves following indications from Tigrayan forces that they planned to advance on the country's capital.
This pit, which is dug very deep, will be where the enemy will be buried, not where Ethiopia disintegrates. We will bury this enemy with our blood and bones and make the glory of Ethiopia high up again.
CGTN's Giram Jalana joins us for more and the latest from the capital, Ethiopia. Hi, Giram. What's the latest on the situation in Ethiopia? Also, we're hearing this, Giram, about the special U.S. envoy who's expected there. What more can you tell us about that as well?
Well, Hannah, the situation now is that, as we have reported before, the heavy fighting has continued, especially in the two most strategic locations now seem to be in the hands of the TPLF, Dese and Kombolcha cities. These are very important. And around these two cities, the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the Amhara Regional State Force, against the TPLF force, the fighting has continued. According to reports, ENDF is saying that it is gaining ground, and it is perhaps able to push them away from those cities. At the same time, TPLF is saying that it is in a position to push even further away from those cities and perhaps march into Addis Ababa, the capital, alongside the OLA force. When it comes to the United States envoy, yes, we have heard that Jeffrey Feltman, the Eastern Africa envoy for President Joe Biden, is now in Addis Ababa, according to reports from officials that we have heard. By the way, Jeff Feltman is attempting to broker peace between the TPLF and the central government itself, so that a bloodshed can be avoided or any sort of war from now on can be stopped. According to the source, also, we have heard that Jeffrey Feltman is expected to speak to Ethiopian officials, from the foreign minister to perhaps the prime minister himself. So we have to wait and see what's going to be the result of that discussion. But we can confirm that Jeffrey Feltman is now in Addis Ababa.
Giram, from our previous discussions with you, you did mention that just from the part of residents who are in Addis Ababa, there's general calm and people have continued on with their lives as usual. But how are people reacting to the call by the government urging them to take up arms to defend the capital?
Well, the call made by the Prime Minister and other officials in their respective positions, including the mayor of Addis Ababa, have made similar calls for people to take up arms, be enlisted in the Ethiopian National Defense Force, enter training centers, training camps, so that they can fight for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. The response seems to be very, very positive by and large. We can confirm also today that the Addis Ababa city administration has, it has sent hundreds of young men who are willing to join the Ethiopian National Defense Force. The sending of ceremony was held at the Ababa Bikila Stadium, one of the biggest stadiums here in Addis Ababa city. The mayor was there. So this kind of response are being seen in different parts of the country as well. This, by the way, can be taken as a positive response from the public when it comes to the prime ministers and other calls to fight against the TPLF force. But it's TPLF sources are also saying that it's not worth it. People need to stay home and avoid any bloodshed because their cause is better for the nation and for the national unity at the same time. All in all, what's happening in the country is not something that anyone has been expecting, perhaps if you talk of 2 years ago or something like that. But now war is there and people's attention has already turned to the war situation. Young men and boys, girls are also joining the army one way or another. And on the other side, on the TPLF side, the story seems to be the same as well.
People should not be talking hate on social media or racial conflict, but rather unite and protect their neighborhoods and the country. Those who are able should also join the fight. If required, I will never step back from joining the fight.
People and government should unite and guard the neighborhood and country hand in hand. The landlords should know the identity of people before renting their houses to keep the enemy from sneaking in.
So, Hannah, what you have heard are the general representation of people who are willing to support the government's call of fighting for the national sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Back to you.
Thank you so much for all that. Giram Chala speaking to us from Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Well, we're going to continue with that story. We're now joined by Mukarrem Mifta, a lecturer of policy studies at the Ethiopian Civil Service University. Thank you so much for joining us, Mukarrem. Let's just start with the Ethiopian Prime Minister vowing to crush his enemies with, quote, what he's called our blood, end quote. What is the impact of this at a time when the international community is calling for dialogue between the two sides?
I think this is a result of the expectation by the state. We know that some few months ago, the state had declared a unilateral ceasefire, which unfortunately was not well received by the TPLF and its military wing. And following that, there was significant shift insofar as the military fight is concerned. There were the TPLF fights were pushing downward to the south, and there were a number of, killings, death, destruction of resources, and I think that through time snowballed and gave the political elites here in Addis Ababa, the federal government, to have more transformative, more radical take on the issue.
Mukarrem, what options do you think are on the table were the two sides to come together and have a dialogue?
Well, I think for the options to have any reasonable and meaningful bearing, we'll have to look at the interests and aspirations of the two fighting groups. We know that the current federal government would like to send a message that whenever there is a disagreement between the federal government and other insurgent groups, that they should not really resort to violence as a means to further their aims and goals, that tabling and discussing issues has to be given priority, and it is that seems not working as far as the TPLF is concerned. And from the information that we gather from the state media, the current government seems to have a position that they will do whatever it takes to make sure that things of this sort doesn't happen. We're not talking about the TPLF alone. There are proclivities among some insurgent groups, like in parts of the Benishangul Gumuz region in Ethiopia and part of the Oromia regional state. There are some insurgent groups who would like to further their aspirations to violence. So I think, despite the pressure from international institutions, actors like the United States and the European Union, I think that the current government is very adamant about in addressing the issue through the war that has already been started.
Mukarem, thank you so much for all that. Mukarem Mifta, lecturer of policy studies at the Ethiopian Civil Service University. Let's turn our focus now to Sudan, where latest reports indicate the formation of a government is imminent. This is the military and ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok are in talks to find a solution to the political crisis. Brigadier General Al-Tahar Abu Hajjad, the advisor to the military leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, says all internal and external initiatives to achieve national interests are under consideration. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Britain and the US have called for the restoration of a civilian-led government and a return to power sharing. Prime Minister Hamdok has been under house arrest in the capital Khartoum since being toppled over on October the 25th. Well, the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security has called for the immediate restoration of civilian rule in Khartoum. The continent's governing body says no unconstitutional change of government will be accepted on the continent.
Sudan is barred from all activities of the African Union until further notice. We must, and they call for one thing, immediate restoration of a civilian-led transition government. This is important. The African Union will not stand idly by when any unconstitutional change of government occurs in the continent.
The United Nations mission in Libya said on Saturday that the country's parliament should amend its election law to hold both presidential and parliamentary elections on the 24th of December as originally envisioned in a peace plan. The House of Representatives, which is Libya's eastern-based parliament, had in the past issued separate laws for a presidential election on the 24th of December and a parliamentary election that would be held at a later unspecified date. Here's Adel Mruhi with more.
The United Nations support mission in Libya has urged the eastern-based parliament to amend the country's elections law. Parliament issued separate laws for the presidential and parliamentary elections, which stipulate that the legislative chamber would be held after 24th of December. UNSMIL wants both elections held on time.
The United Nations support mission in Libya appears to be responding to some pressures from Libyans to amend the law. I believe they are demands from some of the current cabinet members who don't want to be marginalized. That will open the room for individuals like Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Deiba to run for the presidency. That will enrich the presidential race and will spark more competitiveness between the candidates.
The parliament-approved presidential elections law did allow public servants to run while preserving their posts if they lost the vote. But it only allowed candidates who stepped aside from their positions 3 months before the election to run, which bars any current cabinet member from vying.
The parliament is not completely fulfilling its role in issuing legislations, which is giving room for others to criticize and suggest changing laws. The amendments that the UN envoy is asking for, however, could delay the vote. So in a way, they're asking for time, and that request could be related to evacuating fighters. With only 15 days remaining on the vote, they don't have enough time to evacuate them.
So far, 44 members of parliament have rejected the UN mission in Libya's recommendation to amend the election laws. With less than 2 months remaining over Libya's most crucial political milestone, the United Nations support mission in the country says it wants election laws that suit everyone. The eastern-based side wants to hold the presidential poll first, while the western-based side wants to finish the parliamentary elections first. UNSMIL says that both elections must be held simultaneously, and both of them must be open for anyone who wants to run. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, let's not take a short break, but here's what's still to come on Africa Live. African leaders shared their plans to avert climate crises at the ongoing summit in Glasgow. And one of China's biggest trade shows to kick off in Shanghai.
How will your world change today? What happens here? what happens there, or what you make happen for yourself. If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. So our continuing coverage of the UN climate talks, also known as COP26. Majority of African heads of state have shared their plans to avert catastrophic climate change at the ongoing summit in Glasgow. And as CGTN's Daniel Aramoy reports, the leaders have called for a binding global agreement to deal with the climate crisis.
African heads of states have described the climate crisis affecting their respective countries as dire. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan, in her remarks, called for a universal and meaningful climate agreement.
We know what is required, and we know that if the world will not act accordingly, the countries like ours will, with low adaptive capacity, have no options but to brace for more devastating impacts. However, what we all ought to remember is when the drastic climate changes hit, it will choose no location, might or weak, poor or rich country.
Namibian President Hage Geingob stressed the need for a spirit of solidarity by the international community.
Climate change and the worsening ecological crisis obey no sovereign boundaries. COP26 is the international community's last chance to collectively overcome the disconnect between a divided international system and a global calamity that threatens us all.
Other fallouts like poverty, gender disparities, and youth unemployment are intensifying, especially in the COVID-19 era.
Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo urged developed countries to fulfill their legal responsibilities for mitigation, a stance echoed by many other African leaders.
We must find a solution that is equitable and fair, a solution that levels the playing field, a solution that recognizes the historical imbalances between the high emitters and low emitters.
Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari called for international financial support to help developing countries mitigate the effects of climate change.
Mr. President, I would like to state that attaining national and global climate change goals will require adequate and sustained technical and financial support to developing countries.
Despite the devastating impacts of climate change, many African leaders say the continent can still prevent the worst impact of climate change with fast and ambitious actions. Daniel Aramoy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, as the impact of climate change is reported to be increasing across the world each year, more and more young people are taking part in efforts to address that challenge. Climate activists from Africa have added their voice by calling on world leaders meeting in Glasgow to take concrete action and address the climate crisis before it's too late. CGTN's Daniel Aramoy is back with this report.
The ongoing COP26 summit in Glasgow reflects global acknowledgement that climate change is a threat. As world leaders meet to chart the way forward, climate activists are demanding action rather than promises.
The children cannot live on words and empty promises. They are waiting for you to act. Please open your hearts and then act.
In Africa, many young people are growing up in fear, as climate change ravages their homes and destroys livelihoods. There are growing concerns that inaction today could only lead to a greater impact on future generations.
This conference is one of the most important meetings in history. You have the chance to make decisions and reach agreements which will affect the lives of generations to come. You are in a position of extraordinary power. You can change forever the trajectory we are on. You can make a world that is once again full of hope, not fear.
The speed of climate change continues to exceed most scientists' predictions. While droughts and rising temperatures are causing forest fires, cyclones are causing flooding and harvests to be lost. Analysts say climate action will fail without the inclusion of the voices of the world's younger generations. Daniel Arap Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
One of China's biggest trade shows is about to kick off in Shanghai. Chinese President Xi Jinping will address the opening ceremony of the China International Import Expo via video. Chen Tong joins us now from Shanghai to tell us more about the expo. Chen, tell us more about this expo. What do we expect there?
Hi there, Hannah. Yes, it has been the 4th year since Shanghai held the China International Import Expo. But this year, the number of companies and the countries attending the expo will hit another record high. Some 3,000 companies from 127 countries and regions will be attend. And we are going to see imported products brought by companies from developed countries and also developing economies. The total exhibition area has been expanded to 366,000 square meters, a significant rise from last year's figure. And as I mentioned earlier, it has been the 4th year, but we have many firsts this year. For example, this year we are going to have the very first special section for culture and art products, where we're going to see paintings and sculptures brought by renowned artists like Picasso and Monet. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are going to have the very first online country exhibition, where technologies such as 3D and virtual reality will be used to let online viewers take a closer look at these imported products. And 49 countries and international organizations will be attending the online exhibition. And among them, there are actually many African countries, such as Congo, Mauritius, and Uganda. And speaking of African countries, African products such as tea, coffee, and honey will be on show this year. And African countries have already been very active in attending China's International Import Expo. For example, last year, South Africa signed deals with $210 million with Chinese buyers. And definitely this year, we're going to expect that figure to continue to rise. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much for that, Tong. Jen Tong speaking to us from the expo in Shanghai. Well, for years, Europe has been the main destination for Kenyan flowers. However, the lucrative industry is now eyeing China as it seeks to diversify its exports. Redlands Roses is among the companies that have made inroads in China. But as CGTN's Down Arab Moy reports, high tariffs remain an impediment.
Roses, they do not hurriedly bloom, but once they do at this flower farm tucked away northeast of the Kenyan capital Nairobi, they come in almost all shades. Redlands is one of the Kenyan companies that produces roses for export to Europe and most recently China.
So the Chinese market is a very diverse market. It's very fashionable in the sense that every new variety that comes in, they want to try it out. Yeah, so that is the one thing that we really appreciate about the Chinese market.
The company started exporting cut flowers to China in 2015. China is one of the top markets that Kenya has long been eyeing because of its keen interest in Kenyan premium flowers. The Chinese government has gone the extra mile to encourage trade with African countries, making it possible for Kenyan flower growers to access the Chinese market.
We believe that China remains one of the major markets that we can do business with in the cut flower and ornamentals subsector. And we are very keen. We are always there during the shows that happen so that we start promoting the brand of Kenyan flowers in the Chinese market.
While the country cut a niche in Europe, it's yet to maximize the Chinese market. High tariffs and lack of direct flight to China's main cities has limited Redland's roses to only one destination, Guangzhou.
The freight charges have become really high. All our clients are complaining that for them to buy the same number of boxes now costs them almost twice as much compared to before. So now it limits their purchase capacity.
Kenya's Flower Council says plans are underway to create a better business environment.
We have a strategy, and the Chinese market is one of them in terms of expansion. We call it emerging market. And we have aligned these also to the government's vision around the export promotion strategy, so that we are working in line with what the government is looking at.
In 2020, Kenya exported 173,000 metric tons of cut flowers, employing over 200,000 people directly and an estimated 2 million indirectly. Still, it's a start. Redlands and others are optimistic about the future. And for some, like Joyce Mugure, more market means much needed employment. Mugure has been a flower farm worker for 11 years.
I've been working here for long, trying to get something to assist in my family. And I've seen that this work is very good, and I like it very much. So since it has helped me, I have gained experience of how I can support my family.
The East African country is among the top 4 suppliers of cut flowers and ornamentals in the world. For now, cut flowers remain Kenya's second largest export after tea, contributing around 1% of the country's gross domestic product. Daniel Arab Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Let's have now for a second short break and return your business news, including the IMF nears a debt relief deal with cash-strapped Zambia.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Time now for a look at what's happening in the world of business. The International Monetary Fund says that it's very optimistic about reaching a lending arrangement with Zambia, one of just 3 countries that sought debt restructuring under a G20 framework. In November, Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt after failing to keep up with payments on nearly $13 billion of international debt. About a quarter of this debt is held by either China or Chinese entities. President Hakainde Hichilema has pledged to reduce the fiscal deficit, restore economic growth, and review mining policies in Africa's second largest copper producer. Well, Kenya's private sector activity grew faster in October, partly because it was helped by government easing some restrictions aimed at limiting the spread of COVID-19. In late October, President Uhuru Kenyatta lifted a nighttime curfew that had been in place since March of 2020, a move that is expected to spur economic activity. The market Stanbic Bank Kenya Purchasing Managers Index rose to 51.4 in October from 50.4 a month earlier. The 50 mark separates growth from a contraction in activity. Business activity expanded at the fastest pace in the past 5 months, driven by higher demand and output. The improvement in domestic demand was driven by increased client spending, primarily in wholesale and retail trade. The Finance Ministry forecasts an economic growth rate of 6% this year, compared with a 0.3% contraction in 2020. Foreign direct investment in Egypt has dropped 30% over the last 3 years, partly due to the effects of the coronavirus. The country, however, still received the highest amount in FDI over the period compared to other African counterparts. The amount of investment dropped from $7.5 billion to $5.2 billion. CGTN's Hannah Viviers has the details.
A main source of hard currency for Egypt, foreign direct investments have not yet fully recovered from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic.
Foreign investments in the last 6 months reached $3.4 billion against $5 billion in the year before. There is an apparent slowdown. The energy and gas sector are the main attractions for investors after the latest huge gas discoveries. Also, real estate projects and tourism sectors, especially new cities, is encouraging. So, the activity in the real estate as well as building touristic villages and tourist destinations.
Egypt is still a top attractor of foreign direct investments in the continent. However, with its strong infrastructure, economic growth and big population, experts believe it should attract even much more investor inflows. Most of the non-petroleum investments have been in the services and real estate sectors, whilst the government is targeting the manufacturing industries.
After the strong infrastructure built by Egypt and the aggressive economic reforms on the last few years, the base is there to flourish. Now, there must be more emphasis on the industrial sector. It has to be well promoted to attract investors. I think it should prosper soon.
One manufacturer is Amr Fatouh, a top producer of polycarbonate sheets. He says the country has big potential.
Egypt's geographical and strategic location in the center of the world and connecting several continents make it ideal for investments. Egypt's economy has absorbed that shock from the pandemic because we had ongoing mega infrastructure projects which employed a large number of workers and sustained the economy. The challenges we have now are similar everywhere. Problems in shipping, in the supply chain, which has been broken up. We expect it and hope it will recover soon.
The government has also been trying to fix a depleted and complicated bureaucratic system that has for decades pushed many investors away. Experts acknowledge the efforts by the state, but say more would be welcomed.
I'm calling on the government to continue on its path to provide more facilities and relax regulations for the local businessmen, because the foreign investor would enter the market when he sees the Egyptian businessmen are succeeding.
Analysts believe once the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic is diminished, the FDIs will pour back into the North African country. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Over in southern Africa, Zimbabwean mining companies are pushing the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe to ring-fence the 40% surrender requirement component and allow firms to pay for essential services and taxes at the official exchange rate to rescue the multi-billion-dollar sector. The development comes at a time when the miners are losing 20% gross export proceeds due to the exchange rate disparities.
A recent State of Zimbabwe's mining industry survey found that the majority of industry players are confident of ramping up production, expect to use retained profits to expand operations, and the overall industry's capacity utilization is expected to grow to 83% in 2022. However, hopes of realizing those bullish forecasts may be dashed if mining houses are not allowed to retain more of their own foreign currency earnings. Foreign exchange controls compel mining companies to surrender 40% of their export receipts to the central bank at the official exchange rate, despite incurring domestic costs pegged at the much higher parallel market rate.
Mining houses are saying that really they're losing value by selling their money to the central bank at the 98-to-1 level. Unfortunately, the problem is this, is the exchange rate real? And I think this is where the debate rages in the marketplace. Is the government or the Reserve Bank artificially holding the exchange rate at 99 when the market's trading at 180? Or is the 180 correct and actually the 99 is an artificially held rate? I would premise that it's somewhere between the two.
The Chamber of Mines is lobbying authorities to retain at least 80% of foreign currency earnings. Government, on the other hand, is looking for more hard currency sources to pay for critical exports such as electricity and to fund the weekly foreign currency auction. Failing to grant the industry the desired reprieve could leave players hamstrung.
We are actually making it difficult for the mining industry to meet the USD 12 billion, value by 2023, because that is going to make, exploration difficult. It is going to make, because I said exploration is internal funds, it's going to be difficult if internal funds are restricted by these surrender, levels. And we are also going to retrogress in terms of mining, because generally all these costs at the end of the day affect the whole value chain in the mining industry.
The mining industry report also noted that the industry profitability in 2022 is expected lower than 2021 due to rising operating costs. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
The latest in sport after the show break, including Senegal's Sadio Mane on target as Liverpool head into the knockouts of the UEFA Champions League.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far